How does this start? How do I get to the point of, whether it's with my parents or my brothers or my, my intimate partner, how do I go from loving, caring to raising my hand on them? Like, is there phases, or I don't think it goes from one extreme to the other extreme. Can you tell us a little bit of, maybe it might be a little bit of a yelling, manipulation? If you can go into some of those steps, and people that way they can identify, like, hey, am I in a abusive relationship? I think that would be something really good for the audience.
Yeah, I think it'd be really great. I first want to start off by saying I'm not in any way an expert of any sort. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I have my experience and credential. You can look that up. But at the same time, I want to be sure to make it clear that not every experience is the same, and that what we're providing is just an example. Yep. And it's important to know, if you notice a little bit of something from the early stages, that you may see there are ways to deal with it. It's not end all be all. I just want people to know, that we don't cause a mass exodus.
Yeah. Yeah. Just like, I'm being domestically, we
don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. Yeah. But it's important to have that knowledge. And we'll, at the end of this, also talk about how to combat it, how to rebuild healthy relationships. So I also want to go back to what you said about the healthy versus toxic relationships. Toxic is such a trendy word these days. Yeah. And it's really dangerous for us to be, flinging it around. It's good that we're getting more people comfortable with recognizing things that are right and wrong in relationships, and what you should want and what you shouldn't want. But there's also this kind of I don't know how to explain it. Like, there's like this trendiness around people who like proudly or like gleefully talk about toxic traits.
Yeah. I think there's that, but then there's also the opposite side where someone holding someone accountable would be like, that's toxic. And you're like,
that's not enough.
So I feel like it's like you go super extreme on one side or the other when you use toxic, because it's like, no, I'm not being toxic. I'm just calling you out on your stuff. Yeah. Versus I really am being someone that is very manipulative or very bad for your relationship. So I guess if we're in that middle ground, what is toxic in a relationship?
Well, I would say also when people yell, that's toxic, I'm like, it's like the ref throwing out a red and just running away. You got to explain it. So
hey, I love the football analogy.
It don't make sense.
Sir, what? I got a whole ball.
And exactly. And if everyone in every spectator had a red and a yellow and they were just throwing it out whenever, that's dangerous. Nobody knows what to do. Everybody will sit down.
Everything's arbitrary. There's no rules. There's no table.
Yeah. And so I think I would start by saying, when it comes to a relationship, one of the early signs from what has been heard from like discussions with survivors in particular is, first, it varies across, but it generally can begin with the issues with trust. So, we'll see there's tropes in movies and so on where there's that one person usually the husband or the man who's like, why were you looking at that person? Or why was this going on? Like really, really extreme jealousy arises. Mm-hmm. That is a real symbol of someone who's trying to have power or control that isn't threatened in any way. And they see that the person themselves they're trying to control is a threat to that power and control. So you start to see there's suspicion, there's a tension that's kind of building up. Another form is kind of, it all comes down to power and control. But when you start to see people, see a person in a relationship being extremely controlling on certain matters, how the person acts, what they look like, what they're presenting, where they're going, how they get there.
Who they can be with.
Who they can't be with. Oh, I don't like that one cousin of yours. Yeah. I don't like the way you be looking at me, or I don't like that guy at your office that keeps coming around talking. What you mean? Like, you see what I mean? And then what we see it as, we have to remember everything is kind of blanketed with a sense of trust and love that comes with being someone that you're in a relationship with. So when you see these signs, you don't see them. You don't see them.
Because you think they're doing it to protect you.
That's the blinding part
he loves me. It
about.
Makes sense. That's as to why they're doing that. Like I get it. It's because he loves me, so on and so forth. But that's when we start to see it creeping up. And usually what happens after that in terms of progression is that the personal relationship, the time where the people are together, it's very tense. Like I said, there's a lot of tension there, where usually that the person who is the abuser in that sense, which could be male or female, the abuser in that sense is dictating what happens next, how things go, when they're going to be intimate, when they're not going to be intimate, things they talk about. You see what I mean? That other person, we have an abuser and a survivor in particular. What we see is that the survivor is subject to whatever the abuser wants or says. And then I'll use victim at this term. I don't like using survivor. I like using survivor when I'm talking about a person. Yeah. But in this case, now that we're just talking, X, Y, I want to make it clear that it's abuser and victim, because that person is victimized. That's what that is. And so basically, if you think of it, the abuser, whatever they want is what happens. They set the status quo, they set the standard, and then the victim sets everything around that person.
Let me ask you a question, right? Hopefully nobody gets upset. Does the abuser get that fuel from the victim? Like, for example, I see in the Muslim community, it could be other faith as well. It's like, I let the man make all the decisions, right? So whatever the man says, we go with. And exactly a lot of women followed that trend. You know what I mean? What you're and then when the men start making all the decisions, they start getting that power trip, right? They get that ego gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when you go against their decision, it's like, hey, I'm making all the decisions here.
So let me. I see exactly what you're saying, and I think this is a great example. The way that you're describing it is very cause and effect, right? And unfortunately, what we need to catch in terms of how we speak is you're putting the onus of the abuse onto the victim, and you're labeling them in this case as an enabler, which is very common. This is a great example of how innate victim blaming is in our community. So just showing you an example of it, because I'm actively working against making sure I don't do that, because we're so used to saying, well, this person must have caused it. Because in our logical brain, we're trying to see cause and effect.
Yeah, there's an A leads to B leads to C.
When we talk when we talk about human psychology, we want to see this went there. This is green, you moved. This is red, you stopped moving. So what you mentioned, for example, is the victim themselves is not enabling it. That is where culture, tradition, religion comes into play. For example, if I'm a Muslim woman and I'm married to a Muslim man, I am going to, when I've married that person, I have chosen to have that person fulfill their duties as prescribed to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is being the head of the household, managing the finances, so on and so forth, right? I have chosen to give that person that role because I trust and love them. Then if that person chooses to abuse that power or that role, I am not an enabler in that sense, because an enabler actively knows that person is going to do something that is either harming to themselves or others. In this case, me giving that person that position doesn't mean that I knew they were going to do harm to themselves or others. And so it's...
I see what you mean.
You see what I'm saying?
I kind of get what you're saying. Because I guess in my head, I was trying to look at it as devil advocate, where it's like, what if that person is coming from a prior relationship where they were a victim, and they go into the new one with the same mentality of victimhood, so that not that it enables the abuser, but someone else that has that in them to do it can just slide right into place.
That's also when we have to talk about that abusers can recognize those who are best to be abused, if that makes sense. They recognize vulnerabilities. That's why I said, participating in domestic abuse, becoming an abuser is a choice. There is choice in that. And so, unfortunately, what we see with survivors, in terms of the research, is usually if they're in a relationship that is abusive, their next relationship is more than likely going to also be abusive, because abuse changes you. Yeah. It becomes you have to remember, a lot of times survivors are with this person for a very long time. It's a very slow burn. Many of times there are times where survivors try to get out and come back in, because life happens.
We've seen stories about that.
Life happens. And so we have to recognize that being abused increases your likeliness of being in a relationship that is also abusive. Why? Because it's easier for abusers to spot and target those who are victims. And that's the reality of it. I mean, let's break it into we live in a capitalist world. Think about it this way. When you're marketing to someone, you don't market to someone who has nothing to do with what you're trying to do. Your approach is targeted towards a specific audience.
Target market for a reason.
For a reason. And unfortunately, when we talk about violence and abusers, they use patterns. They find people who are perfectly vulnerable. And that, once again, it just shows you it's a choice of theirs. And it just also shows you that person didn't deserve it. That person is not, that's not what they want. It's not a mentality. What it is it's trauma. It's the effect of being under an abusive person for many, many years. It will change your psyche. It will change your self-esteem, your sense of identity. That's the thing that people don't recognize, that being with an abuser, their main tactic is to take you away from who you are.
So can abuse go from, say, a relationship with an intimate partner, so a husband or wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, to parents or to siblings, and vice versa?
Yes, 100% yes. A lot of, I would say one thing that's really unfortunate is a lot of young people who are having trouble with relationships now, many of them will cite abusive relationships that they saw from their own parents or from people in their community, or they had some sense of proximity or closeness to an unhealthy and abusive relationship. And we have to recognize that it permeates the sense of self again. It permeates the psyche, who you are, how you behave, what you align yourself to subconsciously and consciously. And that's why all of this that we're talking about is trauma, man. Like trauma is in a neurophysiological sense, it's the changing of the brain. Something happens and it causes a change, a significant change. And we would be very naive to think that someone can function healthily when they don't address it or when they are exposed to it for long periods of time. It changes that person, how that person sees the world, and most importantly, how they see themselves.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for watching the clip from this excellent episode. If you guys loved it, make sure you guys go and subscribe. So over in this area. And if you guys want to watch more of these clips and full-length videos, you can go right over here. Alright, so watch the video.